This is Module 1B of our course HIS 218, and in this module we are still on definitions, and we started by trying to ask ourselves the questions: what is terrorism? And to answer that question by digging into an understanding of what terrorism is, to attempt to understand what terrorism is. And in trying to understand what terrorism is, we looked at a definition, we picked from so many, and we studied one particular definition that brought to bear certain things. That first, that terrorism has to be carried out by persons, organizations, or governments, and it must contain some of these key issues, these key elements that very critical in understanding what terrorism is. We went on to explain that judging by the characteristics of terrorism, it is very difficult to differentiate between terrorism and other forms of violence, and there's a thin line between these various concepts. And we established the fact that in order to be able to understand terrorism properly, we must view terrorism, from the viewpoint of those who are trying to define terrorism, because there are so many definitions and many people, many organizations, countries, groups try to define terrorism by labeling people, other people, organizations as terrorists because of their own viewpoint, because of their own ideological viewpoint. And that has created much of the confusion about the definitions of terrorism that we have found out there. And as a consequence of this, terrorists and terrorist organizations are in a constant state of flux. You may believe or label a particular group today as a terrorist group, but the moment certain issues, certain conceptual issues change about that group, the next day the group may no longer be a terrorist group, because of these ideological underpinnings, the way people look at these groups because of their own ideological underpinnings. For instance, in 1985, Afghan fighting the Soviet invasion, were seen as a terror, were seen as freedom fighters. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and the people rose up, to fight against the Soviets. But the labeling of these people as freedom fighters was done by the United States, at that point in time, because of their ideological position. They saw them as trying to defend their right, to life, livelihood, their right to democracy, so on and so forth. So we can see that the ideological position of the United States determined the labeling of Afghan fighters in 1985. But if we see the same situation in 2015, we see Afghan fighters, fighting against U.S. invasion in 2015 being, labeled as terrorists. There is a disparity, and that disparity is, drawn from the ideological position of the same United States. So this is an example of what I was trying to talk about when I said that the definition of terrorism is often determined by the labeling, by the application. The various contests and controversies that we have about who is a terrorist or who is not a terrorist, how terrorism should be defined, in some instances is often determined by the labeling, and that labeling is influenced by our ideologies, our own initial ideological positions from which we see the various groups or persons which we are trying to make reference to. So in 1985, the Afghan fighters, they carried out violent attacks, they intimidated, they used all kinds of methods of coercion and so on and so forth, violent methods. But at that point in time, they were known as freedom fighters. But now, because of who they oppose, the ideals which they stand against, they are now known as terrorists. Now, if we look at this situation, for instance, we would see the same kind of dynamic playing out. Hamas, for instance, here is rejected by the United States, as terrorist groups, while Fatah is seen, on the other hand, as being freedom fighters. Now, this also plays or borders on the ideological issue that I raised earlier on. Hamas is opposed to the United States, while Fatah is opposed to Hamas. And the fact that Hamas, in Lebanon, is opposed to the United States is, easily labeled as a terrorist group because it is opposing the great power in the world, the great hegemon in the world. While Fatah, who is in some form of civil conflict between themselves and Hamas, is seen as, a positive force because they are fighting, to upset the position of Hamas, which would obviously be to the advantage of the United States and Western powers. So we also see this dynamic playing out here, that the groups that are labeled as terrorist groups may not necessarily, be in relation to their activities per se, but more likely in relation to the ideological beliefs of the people who label them as terrorists. Another example here is, in this little picture here, is showing us when we come across terrorist activities, in Western countries, maybe somebody attacks a building and destroys the building, it is referred to as terrorism. But when Western powers, bomb uh, cities and countries in other parts of the world, let's say like in Somalia, in Iraq, or in Syria, it is known as militarism, or it is even known as counterterrorism, but it is not seen or perceived as terrorism. And many people at this point in time do not even see governments in the position of terrorism because of their own ideological positions, that they are trying to defend democracy, so they are not terrorists. But in the light of the definitions of terrorism, which we initially brought to play, we will see that not only individuals, can be terrorists, but also countries, nations, or governments can also engage in terrorist activities and can also be regarded as terrorists. So, to this end, we can say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, because this is a famous statement that was played about, in the 80s, when terrorism was really being, pushed back and forth. Freedom fighters were claiming to be fighting for democracy, while governments were labeling them as terrorist groups. And one of the classical examples of this is that of Nelson Mandela, who, according to the United States government watch list, was regarded as a terrorist, you know, while he was fighting for freedom of South Africans, black South Africans, under the banner of the ANC in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And by the time, many people looked at the Mandela balance, they wondered at the great question whether Mandela, was a freedom fighter or a terrorist. But on the whole, by the time the man was released from prison, he said this, that I was called a terrorist yesterday, but when I came out of jail, many people embraced me, including my enemies. And that is what I normally tell other people who say those who are struggling for liberation in their countries are terrorists. Now, this viewpoint expressed by Madiba here, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, is something that has become of great importance in the debate in trying to understand what terrorism is. And like I said earlier, it brings us back to the issue of labeling and ideology. So, who is labeled a terrorist is dependent on the ideology of the person that is attempting to make that labeling. This brings us to the end of this particular module, and I will see you in the next module.